very brief lottery training that we're providing to all of our schools. We had some good feedback when we did this in the fall of 2020, so we thought we would do it again here as you are in the midst of application season with lotteries potentially coming down the road, usually next month or perhaps in March for many of our schools. So we wanted to provide you all with about a 30-minute training today. We hope this is helpful for you all. Again, a couple of asks before we get into the content. First, I'm going to hopefully cover all of the materials today in again, about a half hour or less. I do have a number of colleagues of mine that are on this call as well, and they are going to be manning the chat box. So I would highly encourage, if you have questions as we go through the presentation today, it's only about 12 slides of content, that you use the chat box to send those questions, and my team will interrupt me and read those questions out loud, and we'll try to get you answers in the moment. Otherwise, we are planning to hold the second half of our hour today for just open Q&A. So if you'd prefer to write down your questions and hold them till the end, myself and other members of the SPCSA staff are happy to address them in that manner as well. So again, welcome. We hope that today's training is helpful. We are recording it. So again, we appreciate you all staying muted throughout the first 30 minutes and using that chat box. Here are our goals for today's presentation. First, we want to remind schools of the requirements related to student lotteries. We've noticed that sometimes schools have pretty important and pertinent questions related to the mechanics of student lotteries, so we want to make sure you have a clear understanding of them. Second, we want to make sure you have an understanding of allowable enrollment preferences that you can include in your school's lottery policy, or perhaps we can remind you that you can alter your policy in the future and what those could include. Third, we want to talk about weighted lotteries. Some of you may have heard that we've had a number of schools implement weighted lotteries over the past several years. And so we want to provide you just with a quick overview of that if that's something that your school might be interested in down the road. And then fourth, and perhaps most important, we want to provide an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So here's our agenda. Again, I'm hoping to only go about 25 or 30 minutes on content. We'll talk about, again, those lottery requirements. We'll talk about preferences. We'll talk about weights. I think it's important to emphasize that preferences are, they do trump, in other words, weights, but we want to talk about both of those pieces as sometimes there's some confusion there. We will also speak briefly to how we provide oversight and monitoring of our admissions process. And then again, we're going to have that open Q&A at the end. So let's dive in. This slide is probably a review for everyone on the call, but I do think it's important for context. So public charter schools are open and free to all students. Really important that not only your information about your school and the application process emphasizes that, but it's also on your website, and you make sure to emphasize that with your verbal communication with students and families. They have no admission criteria. So to be clear, you cannot require things of students to submit an application to your school. Schools should not discriminate and may not discriminate. And I've included both a statutory reference here for you all to review at your leisure, as well as a regulation that speaks to what you may not include in your application process. So the NRS site there will cover things from race, gender, religion, disability, all things that you may not ask during the process. And then the regulation is going to dive into details such as you may not test to have a student be admitted to the school. You may not require an interview process for a student to enroll. You may not charge fees or have a fee-based policy to enroll a student. Those things are not allowable here in Nevada. And then finally, all of our schools have enrollment caps that are built into the contracts. And so you'll see in that note below, because all of our schools have enrollment caps, lotteries are really the mechanism that is used to ensure a fair and equitable admissions process for all applicants if demand is high. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. So this is a slide that I'd probably put a star on if you printed the materials or have them out in front of you. Charter schools and networks manage their own application windows and lottery dates. You heard me reference earlier that many of our schools have lotteries, application windows that start right around the first of the year and go into February and March. Some of them start a little bit later, but it's right around this time when those application windows start to open. Charter schools and networks are responsible for developing and releasing those. The SPCSA does not do that. All applications are accepted during the window, which must be at least 45 days. I want to repeat that. There's been some confusion on this before. So all applications are accepted during the window, which must be at least 45 days long under Nevada statute. And that means that if you have 500 applications that arrive in 45 days, they all have an equal chance, if you're using an unweighted lottery, an equal chance of being drawn in the lottery, no matter when they were received by the school. If fewer pupils apply than there are available seats, you do not need to hold a lottery. So I'll use a basic example. If you have 100 seats in the first grade that are available and you only have 90 first graders that apply for those seats, you do not need to hold a lottery. All of those students may be offered enrollment and admission for those seats. If more pupils apply than there are available seats, a lottery is required, even if it is just for one individual grade level. The lottery must include all eligible students, again, no matter the order in which the applications are received. So let me use that same 100 example so I'm abundantly clear. If you have 100 seats in the first grade and you have 105 applications for first grade, all 105 students in an unweighted lottery go into a lottery with an equal chance of having of gaining entry into one of those 100 seats, no matter in the order in which the applications were received, as long as they were received within that 45-day window or whatever your window may be. Sometimes we have schools that go a little longer than that, which is completely fine. It just must meet that 45-day minimum. Students and families should be notified shortly after the enrollment window closes or the lottery is conducted. If a lottery is required, schools should maintain a numbered list of all students, including those on the wait list. Students and families should be given a reasonable amount of time to accept or decline a seat. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. If a student declines their seat, that is when you use the wait list, and you should utilize that in the order determined by the lottery, so that if someone does decline that seat and chooses to go to another school, or perhaps they move, you offer enrollment to that first person on the wait list. If a student submits an application after the window, their name should be added to the wait list on a first come, first served basis. That is only true if you had to use a lottery. So I'll go back to the example that I started on this slide. If you have 100 available seats and you have 90 students that apply for an individual grade level during the enrollment window, all 90 of those students are enrolled. And then if you have someone come in maybe the following Monday and they want to apply, that student can be offered admission right then and there because you have 10 available seats. So a few reminders. We already talked about admission criteria, but again, just it's worth reiterating. You may not discriminate based on race, gender, religion, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and gender, but you may not require prior academic achievement or test results to gain entry into a charter school. You may not require interviews or letters of recommendation, and you may not require any financial incentives. Those previous links that I included, I believe 2 slides prior to this one, should be helpful in providing guidance, but if you have questions about this, please do not hesitate to reach out to SPCSA staff. We also require a 2-part enrollment process. So you should think about it in this way. Prior to the lottery, you're asking just very basic information of interested students. You're asking for their name, their date of birth, their age, the grade level they're completing, and their contact info, just in case you need to get a hold of them. After a lottery, if a student is admitted or wins the lottery, for lack of a better phrase, and is offered a seat, that is when you get the additional details such as health information. If this student has an IEP, you begin that process perhaps from their district school so that paperwork can be received in a timely manner. Any English language learner supports, as well as emergency contact info. So again, that 2-part process really ensures and protects you all at the school level from any notion of discrimination. The SPCSA will review application forms annually and may ask schools for lottery results and related information, and I've included that regulation site there just in case you need it. Schools are strongly encouraged to make forms in Spanish when they are released and posted on your website. But again, as a reminder, federal law requires that if you are requested to provide your application form in a different language, you must do so. And finally, this is just a recommendation. There is nothing in statute or reg currently that requires you to have a certain set time for students and families to accept a seat should they be admitted through a lottery. We recommend that it be at least 5 business days because we feel like that's reasonable and does not present any barriers to students and families. If you feel comfortable going more, that's great. If you feel like maybe 72 hours is best for you, that's okay. But we feel like 5 days is a good rule of thumb approach. So let's talk a little bit about enrollment preferences. You heard me say earlier that enrollment preferences sort of trump weights, which we'll talk about next, but public charter schools may give the following students enrollment priority. These are the most common that we see and that are allowable under statute. So siblings of students that are currently admitted can get enrollment priority. Children of employees or members of the committee to form if it's a new school, or the governing board if it's more of an established school and has been in the operations for a number of years. At-risk students, as defined by and approved by the SPCSA, students from overcrowded schools, students from underperforming schools, and students enrolled in a tuition-free pre-K that has an SPCSA approved articulation agreement with the charter school. So let me make a couple things hopefully a little more clear. First, priority essentially means that these categories of students, if they are approved by the SPCSA and are written into your lottery policy, may jump their position in line. In other words, they move to the front of the line before a lottery occurs. So I'm going to go back to my 100 student example because it's kind of easy to understand. If you have 100 available seats in the first grade, and of the 150 students that apply in the first grade, if 10 of those students are siblings of students that are currently enrolled, those students are automatically offered enrollment, and then you have 90 available seats to the lottery. Let's continue on, because some of these priorities, if they're built into your policy, some of these priorities, some schools, have multiple priorities. So if you have siblings, those jump the line and gain access. If you have, let's say, 2 children that are students of employees at your school, those 2 students then jump the line, and you now only have 88 seats to offer in your lottery. So hopefully you can see a little bit about how this works, and you can see how if you have students that qualify in one of these categories, that they are offered admission prior to a general lottery. I do want to draw your attention to the statement at the near the bottom of this slide. If you wish to use more than one priority category, which you may, we require this to be ranked and incorporated into a formal policy by the board and approved by the SPCSA within the charter application process or through a formal amendment. And the reason that's particularly important is because some schools, particularly those that we sponsor that may be smaller in scale, can oftentimes have so few seats available that they are all taken, in rare occasions, by these categories. And so you may get to an instance where you have so many siblings or perhaps so many children of employees in committee to form or governing board members that you do not have available seats for all of these priority categories. So it's really important in your lottery policy that you spell out which priority takes first preference and which is second, third, and so on and so forth, so that if you get into a situation like that, you have a clear document to be able to point to prospective families, or in some cases, maybe your governing board members or employees. Really important that you spell that out to really clearly lay it out for your families and in your community. We also recommend that schools always disclose these priority tiers on the application forms so that they are aware of how they how these work, and certainly if they have a student that maybe does get offered a seat but has younger siblings that aren't quite kindergarten age, that they know that their student would be allowed to be admitted through this process. So I want to talk a little bit about weighted lotteries. So weighted lotteries really change the ability and the weights that are attached to each student of being selected. So certain students have a higher chance of being admitted compared to others. So you'll see in this picture example, certain students receive 2 tickets instead of 1. Higher weights than 2 may also be used. So we're going to talk on the next slide about which categories can allow students to have a greater than 1.0 weight, but this gives you kind of a visual example of how this works. And again, preferences occur first, and then any weights, if you have a policy that also incorporates a weighted lottery, comes second. So in other words, again, we'll go back to the 100 example. If you have 100 available seats and you've got 10 students in your applicant pool that are siblings, those 10 are offered admission. If that's the only preference, the remaining 90 seats are then opened up to a lottery, and then a weights system may be used to fill those 90 seats. So you can have preferences and weights, but it's important to distinguish between the two, and it's certainly important to know which one takes precedent. So there's the regulation for you if you're curious about weighted lotteries, but charter schools, as I said earlier, may give additional weight in favor of one of the following subgroups of educationally disadvantaged students. And they are economically disadvantaged students. We normally see our schools use FRL, as a proxy for this. Students with disabilities, migrant students, students with limited English proficiency or English language learners, students who are neglected or delinquent, students who are homeless, students who are most recent enrollment was in a 1 or 2 star school as defined by the NSPF. I believe we have 3 schools that are currently implementing a weighted lottery. We may have a couple more start this process in the coming months. The most common ones we see right now are schools that want to give additional weight to students that qualify for free or reduced price lunch, and students that qualify as an English language learner. But these are essentially the other options that are available to you if this is something you wish to pursue. And we wanted to make sure that you were really clear on everything that is allowable under regulation. So weighted lottery requirements. If this is something you want to do, there are really 2 important steps. Number 1, you'll need to clarify the weight to be assigned to each of those categories that I outlined on the previous slide. So you heard me say earlier that most commonly we see, or have seen, English language learners and free and reduced price lunch students have the extra weights attached. We have some schools that have done this with just a simple 2.0 weight, so they have 2 tickets into the lottery instead of just the standard 1. We have, I believe, 1 school that has gone all the way up to 5 tickets. So they have a weight of 5 attached to students that can provide documentation that they are FRL. They would qualify for free or reduced price lunch. If you are looking to adjust your policy, the second step is to justify the use of those weights. So we want to make sure that it's aligned to the specific vision and mission of the charter school. And we want to understand the targets that you all are seeking to achieve in your overall demographic of your school, so that it at least meets or exceeds the local school district or geographic area which the charter school is located. We oftentimes see our charter schools shift to a weighted lottery because they are trying to close demographic gaps that they have in their community. And we've seen that be particularly effective with targeted marketing and outreach that occurs throughout this process, but certainly well before the weighted lottery policy is adopted. So again, if this is something that you are interested in, we're happy to talk with you more about it today, or schedule a future call with you and your school team to learn a little bit more about what you may be thinking and perhaps the rationale behind your weights.
Mark, we have a question from the chat.
Oh, great. Thanks, Danny.
In either preferences or weights, can you use zip codes? Example, identified zip codes from your charter as the criteria?
Is the question specifically about weights or preferences?
Kathy, you gave us that question. Do you want to, if you're available on the microphone, do you want to clarify that?
Yeah, truly, like either. Is it ever an allowable like use of like enrollment preferencing or adding weights? Like, could you use it for either?
Great question. My understanding, Kathy, is that that may be allowable in the preferences. You'll see under this slide that I went back to, students from underperforming schools. That is your question, correct?
Yep.
So I think that you could have it be a preference. We would want to probably talk with you about that before we finalize anything, but I believe that it could qualify as a preference, not a weight. It's
Mark,
listed here. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
could I jump in?
Yes.
Yeah, so Kathy, I'll type in the NRS for you. This is Rebecca, but it doesn't allow zip code specifically, but there is a potential to preference students within a 2-mile radius of the school, which is a little bit different than zip code. So you'll need to look at the real specifics of the statutory language, and certainly we can review something specific, but zip code in and of itself doesn't work, but you can sort of use geography. I will note that preferences are not always allowable for schools receiving charter school program grant funds. So certain preferences are allowed under the CSP grant, certain weights are allowed, but if you are receiving CSP funds, as Kathy, I think you are, you need to be real careful as to not violate the requirements of that grant.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Kathy, and thanks, Rebecca. So let me just quickly close out the presentation with a couple more slides. So again, I think we've kind of established the differences between preferences and weights. Preferences are for certain student groups accepted prior to other student groups. We've talked about siblings and then other student groups that could be offered preferences. We've also talked about weights, where specific student groups receive additional chances in the lottery. And again, you'll see that English proficiency or English language learners is one of probably the two most common that we see, and all other students not qualifying would receive 1 ticket. I do want to note that for students, or excuse me, for schools that are providing or seeking to provide or implement a weighted lottery, you can offer these weights to students that show documentation, but it is not required. So in order to get that extra weight, they have to provide you with additional documentation in order to qualify for that. And we are happy to talk about some of those nuances with you. We've had some schools that have had some questions along those lines if they are interested in pursuing a weighted lottery. So that is something that you'll need to be cognizant of through the application window. And then finally, just a reminder of kind of what we are looking for, whether you are implementing a weighted lottery or a more traditional lottery, excuse me. The SPCSA is always going to review school application forms, and we're going to be checking that your application forms and policy conform with the NRS as well as NAC, specifically the 45-day application window. Weighted lotteries and any priority enrollment tiers are allowable, and we'll be checking to make sure all of that is tied off nicely in your admission policy. On occasion, our office may ask for additional information. Sometimes we receive inquiries from parents, but certainly we also like to do sometimes a random sampling of the results of our schools just to make sure that lotteries are running in accordance with statute and regulations. So we may ask for a list of pupils who entered your lottery just to better understand your demand and certainly your breakdown by grade levels. And we also may at any time ask for a copy of your wait list just to understand, again, how your demand looks, and if we receive any questions, it can help provide us with helpful answers. One final note, historically, or I guess I should say the past 2 years, we have provided reminders for schools about their enrollment cap for the upcoming academic year around the 1st of June. We've gotten some, I think, helpful and informative feedback that this information would be more timely and better for you all if we provided it a few months earlier. So our plan is to actually send out enrollment cap reminders to all of our schools by the end of this month so that you have a clear understanding of what your total number of seats available to your students and community is for 22-23, and that should be able to help you run your lottery process a little more seamlessly. And so we wanted to make sure we mentioned that briefly today so you can anticipate that coming your way in about the next week or so. Lastly, if you want to change your lottery policy, the SPCSA believes that constitutes an amendment to your charter application, but we are committed to making this as fairly straightforward as we can. We, I think, have a couple of individuals from schools that have recently modified their lottery policy through an amendment that was approved by the authority. We try to make it as painless as we can. There's actually a specific section in our amendment form that's available online that's dedicated just to this type of amendment, if it's something you wish to pursue. So you do not need to fill out your whole amendment form. It's just about a series of 5 to 7 questions that we would need, along with a brief summary about your rationale for doing so. If that is something that you are thinking about doing, please reach out to the authorizing team, myself, Danny, I believe my colleague Mike Dang is also here today, to set up a time where we can speak about what you're thinking about doing and your timeline for doing so. It's probably a little too late to do a change for your admission process for 22-23, but it's never too early to start thinking about that if you're thinking about 23-24 and beyond. So please reach out to us if you'd like to just speak about what you're seeking to accomplish. Once we have that conversation, you would of course have to submit a formal amendment approved by your governing body, submitted to us for our review, and then we would bring it to our board for consideration at an upcoming meeting. So again, I wanted to make sure everyone was clear that we're always happy to accommodate our schools if this is something you're seeking to implement, and we want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of some of the nuances with lottery changes, as well as our process. And I think that is it. So I am going to turn it back over to Danny to see if there are any questions in the chat box. And then I'm going to not share my screen and we'll open up to Q&A. Danny, I think you can stop the recording as well. Are there any other questions in the chat box?